Shalom. Today, the 27th day of the month of Iyar of the year 5781, and we are standing just 1 week before the eve of the coming festival of Shavuot, the time of the receiving of our Torah. And already this week, on Tuesday night and Wednesday, we shall be celebrating the arrival of the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai on the Rosh Chodesh, the new moon of the month of Sivan, ready for Moses to go up the mountain and come down again as the messenger between God Almighty and the children of Israel, inducing them to receive the Torah with the words Na'aseh v'nishma, we shall do it. And later on we shall hear what it means, what we are accomplishing, and the further horizons of what we are doing. And today, at the request of one of our viewers and supporters, I'm discussing the subject of Sabbateanism and Hasidism, which I think is a very interesting and illuminating subject, particularly since on the festival of Shavuot, we celebrate also the Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day annually of the passing of Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. And what we shall be seeing is that actually not only does Hasidism have nothing to do with Sabbatianism, but in fact it's the very opposite and the very nemesis of Sabbatianism. To just set the stage for this discussion, let me explain that Sabbatianism refers to the spiritual, ideological, occult movement that developed in the wake of the infamous episode of the false messiah of the 17th century of Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai Tzvi was in origins from Macedonia, Greece, the exile of Jews in Greece, and showed up in the land of Israel, and in the 1650s began to announce his messianic mission. And he had a man that became his prophet known as Nathan of Gaza. At that time, Gaza have a very sizable Jewish Torah observant community, and it was there that Shabbatai Tzvi began to spread his influence, which literally rocketed across the entire Jewish world, across the entire Mediterranean seaboard, north, south, Greece, Italy, France, and North Africa, because the message of Shabbatai Tzvi came at a time following the most terrible disasters in Jewish history, known as the decrees of Tat of the years 408 to 409, namely the years 1648 to 1649, the time of the terrible massacres across Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Poland, and adjacent territories, perpetrated by by Cossacks and by all kinds of violent population elements. This was a catastrophe on the scale of the Holocaust. Many people do not realize this. It is estimated that at least 1 million Jewish people in these areas were killed, murdered during that period, often with primitive axes and clubs and other terrible instruments of death by very violent people. And after this catastrophe, the fact that somebody was announcing that he was the Mashiach and the time had come, particularly since he backed himself up with the passages from the Holy Zohar. The Zohar had become revealed in the Jewish world from the 14th century onwards, more and more widely, particularly with the return of the Kabbalistic masters to the city of Tzfat in the late 16th century, the 1550s and onwards, the arrival of Rabbi Moshe Cardvero and Ari. So approximately 100 years after that, or around 100 years after this, that there is a figure who is spouting Kabbalah and apparently doing miracles and having profound electrifying effect upon people was tremendously exciting to many Jewish people after these terrible catastrophes. And it was only when a number of the rabbis of the time felt that it was necessary to check out this person that it began to be discovered that he was a fake. Actually, interestingly enough, it is a universal Torah practice when a Jew wakes up in the morning, before he rises from his bed, he will have a little pitcher of water by his side in a bowl that he can wash his hands, right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand, in order to dispel the spirit of impurity that rests upon the hands during the time that the soul is outside the body during sleep. And not only did they see that he did not carry out this custom, but also that he would sleep on his belly or on his back with his exposed, as it were, to the heavens, which is also a practice that is looked down upon in the Talmud. And from this they inferred that he was actually a fake. And the declaration that he was a fake, coming in the wake of all this excitement, was another crushing disappointment to many, many people. And for that reason, the trauma of the Sabbatean episode of the Sabbatean false Mashiach was one that the Jewish people never really recovered from. And it is to that period, I believe, that we can trace the later inroads of assimilation and secularization that have been the essential story of the Jewish people since that time. Now, it's well known that Shabbatai Tzvi himself was eventually caught by the Turkish authorities who ruled in Palestine as well as in Turkey at the time, and he was imprisoned in Turkey, and he actually ostensibly became a Muslim, and so did many of his Jewish followers in Turkey, who also adopted Islam, at least outwardly, while inwardly remaining faithful to their Moshiach, whom they believed was taking on the fight against the Kalipot, the husks, by taking on the Islamic religion. And so there is a whole group of people in Turkey until today known as the Donme. And the Donme are people who outwardly are Muslims but inwardly are Sabbatians and have never been accepted into mainstream Muslim society in Turkey. Well, now, in that sense, Sabbatism went underground with the Donme, and also I would surmise among tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of the Jewish populations further to the west across Europe, there were many people at that time who we can discern from the history, from examination of documents at the time. There is a definite deterioration in the adherence of Jewish people to the traditional religious observances of their fathers. We know, of course, of the figure of Spinoza, who was excommunicated from the Jewish communities for his revolutionary ideas, and many similar ideas were spreading around the Jewish communities in the wake of the Renaissance and the developing so-called Age of Reason, where Jewish people in many countries who were certainly interested in the literature of the surrounding peoples were imbibing new ideas about a way of life that was freed from the traditional restraints of religion, which were perceived to be based upon superstition and irrational fear. Well, now, the religion preached by Sabbatai Tzvi was actually one of religious anarchy. Every Jew blesses God every day. Blessed are you, King of the universe, who releases the bound, Hamatir Asurim, He who releases the bonds of those who are tied up. Well, the Sabbateans took this to mean that all the things that are asur, forbidden under Torah law, are now released, like we find in the Talmud, in the Midrash, references that in the future the davar acher, the chazir, the pork and bacon will become permitted, and other such traditions. So the idea was that this is now already. And this led to a throwing off of the traditional authority of the Talmud as handed down by the community leaders and by the rabbis, all the generations from the times of the exile from the land of Israel. Well, now, if the Sabbatian movement went underground, it found a new representative in the 1800s by a person that considered himself to be an incarnation of Shabtai Tzvi, and that is the infamous Jacob Frank, Yimach Shemo V'Zichro. Jacob Frank was apparently some kind of Jew. Heaven alone knows exactly where his soul came from, but he was very certainly an example of the wandering Jew, wandering far and wide across Jewish Europe and befriending all kinds of people. And if Shabtai Tzvi had been represented as pushing himself into the Klipot, into the realm of the husks, by converting to Islam, the interest of Jacob Frank was, as it were, as officially presented, to put himself into the husks and convert to the religion of Edom, the religion of Christianity. And Jacob Frank was busy with these projects in the 1750s, gaining influence among many, many Jews who were highly frustrated with the conditions of life under which they lived there in Poland and Russia and Eastern Europe generally, where they were subject to tremendous civic disabilities. They were discriminated against in terms of their inability to enter all kinds of professions and guilds, restricted to certain positions that made them very much hated, for example, as the local bankers and moneylenders, and the people that were the only people who were safe enough to be entrusted by the aristocrats who owned the lands and the towns and the villages, the only people safe enough to be entrusted with actually distilling the liquor, the vodka and other liquors which were used to stupefy the peasantry and keep them quiet. And it was the Jews, by and large, who had these licenses and ran the taverns, but they had to get their debts from the drunken people after they sobered up, and they didn't want to pay their money. And this was a very, very difficult situation, with the aristocratic landlord pressing them for money. Many Jewish people were entirely fed up with this life that they were living, and were beginning to dream about a better life in the new world. So many wanted to just get up and discover the enormous natural wealth that was being described by those who were writing about America in the 1700s. Well, now, in order to understand that Hasidism has nothing to do with Sabbatianism, it should be sufficient to note that the founder of Hasidism, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, who was born approximately at the end of the 1690s and was to pass away in 1760. Baal Shem Tov had already become revealed to the world back earlier, from the age of 36 years old, and by his mature years, mature physically, he had a spiritual maturity from earliest childhood, but by the time of the 1750s, Baal Shem Tov was very widely known and very widely respected. Some of the greatest Talmudic minds of the generation had become drawn to Baal Shem Tov. And let's put it plain and straight, Hasidism is the revival of the path of our ancestors and our fathers, the path of emunah, the path of halacha, observance of the rules of the Torah, of the Shulchan Aruch, the study of the Torah, and particularly the faith that leads to prayer. And the Hasidic movement came to revive what had become a lifeless body of Torah practice by infusing it with neshama, with spirit. And having been acquainted with Hasidim from many different sects from the year 1975 onwards, the Satmar Hasidim, Vishnitz Hasidim, Belzer Hasidim, and Gera Hasidim, and Kotzker Hasidim, and many other smaller groups of Hasidim, the Sanzer Hasidim, and others, having been acquainted with them personally and lived with them, been in their homes on Shabbatot, on festivals, and known the parents, the children, and having prayed with them in Jerusalem for many, many years and being familiar with the study, I can absolutely state with perfect and complete honesty that the Hasidim have no interest whatever in Sabbateanism. Here and there are undoubtedly individual souls that are natural rebels and don't want the Hasidic path. But whether we are talking about Lubavitcher Hasidim or Breslov Hasidim, the focus of Hasidism is following the code of the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, day by day, from dawn until night and through midnight, every day of the year. And that leaves no time for either Sabbatianism or Freemasonry or any kind of conspiratorial groups that so many people are talking about today. There's simply no connection whatever. Anybody who has been familiar with the true Hasidic way of life knows that the first thing in the morning, a man gets up and rushes out to the mikveh to perform his immersion in the mikveh, goes off to the synagogue, puts on his talit and tefillin, prays through about 85 to 100 pages of the prayer book, and then will either go off to his studies or to his work, his business. He'll come back to the synagogue in the afternoon for the afternoon service, again for the evening service. On the Shabbat, he will spend many hours in the synagogue. Nobody is performing any kind of secret occult rituals. Now, before we continue, let's go back. And because here we are touching on the whole concept of conspiracies, dangerous conspiracies, of slanders against Hasidism as being occult, as being Sabbatean. Let's go back, way back to the days of Haman in Shushan in Persia, of the Greeks, of the Romans, all of whom found the children of Israel entirely peculiar, with habits like refusing to wear a mixture of linen and wool, which can be so convenient, habits of refusing to mix meat and milk dishes, habits of refusing to eat very tasty pork and bacon, habits of refusing to drink the wine that one of them had touched, and so on and so forth. And they really hated the Jews. Now, today we can see, in the light of the events of the past few years, how the media are so profoundly influential across society in slanting events and putting their own chosen slant on what is happening, putting their own chosen slant on people and ideas, so that across the mainstream media, to be woke, to be a supporter of BLM, to be a supporter of all kinds of crazy dictators, all kosher, but all kinds of other things. For example, traditional Bible belief and practice, all are now being deprecated and marginalized. All this is slant, and this has been going on for thousands of years. The whole concept of replacement theology, which started with the development, with analysis of the development of Christianity and how Christianity took over the role of the children of Israel as God's chosen people and the instrument of his providence, and tried to replace that with the church. And subsequently, with the rise of Islam and its prophet, Islam took over the traditional mission of Israel of bringing the knowledge of God to all humanity, and Islam claims to have replaced the Torah in this. Well, now, this is exactly what is going on today with Hasidism, with the Jewish ultra-Orthodox, the so-called Haredim. There is a massive disinformation campaign in our mainstream media, including much of the mainstream Jewish media across the world, the secularized Jewish media, in an attempt to defame and downgrade the traditional interpretation of Torah as received by the sages of the Talmud, as reflected in the Shulchan Aruch, and as expressed in the life of the ultra-Orthodox and particularly of the Hasidim. And all this is an attempt to slander the Hasidim by associating the Hasidim with something which many, many people across the world know to be associated with the occult, a completely false association, as false as there is any connection between true Torah rabbinical leaders, true tzaddikim, and the protocols of the elders of Zion. The protocols of the elders of Zion, which is said to have been a forgery in the early 20th century, accusing Jewish financiers and leaders of controlling the world. This has nothing to do with the Torah community, who are not interested in controlling the world. The Orthodox Jewish community is interested only in serving God Almighty through the daily prayers, through the mitzvot, through performing the Shabbat, through following the festivals, through giving charity, performing acts of kindness, through carrying out business ethically, and so on, and have no interest in controlling anyone. Certainly people need to make a living, and unfortunately there are unscrupulous people who make their living in unscrupulous ways, but you cannot take a few individuals and use them to smear an entire community across the world. Now, this has been done historically with Sabbateanism and smearing it to accuse Jewish people of embracing Sabbatism. And what we shall be doing today is seeing exactly how actually this works out in the contemporary state of Israel. So now to go back to Jacob Frank and Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov joined leading rabbis of the time to fight the followers of Jacob Frank. One of the great leaders of this was a man known as Rabbi Yaakov Emden, a very distinguished rabbi in America, who is seen as one of the fathers of modern orthodoxy. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden had many friends in the Christian world. He was a profound Torah scholar, but he was also familiar with the Christian writings and made contacts and peaceful overtures to Christians. And when Jacob Frank was beginning to bring converts to the Catholic Church of Poland and receiving the patronage of the Polish king and aristocracy, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was writing letters to all of his friends explaining that these people are saboteurs and they are not authentic Christian believers at all, but they are bringing Satanism into the church. And eventually his warnings were heeded, and Jacob Frank was kicked out of Poland and had to go from place to place. We'll continue with that in a moment. But here was Rabbi Yaakov Emden and his onslaught against the Sabbateans, and the main focus of Jacob Frank's activities was in the town of Kamenets in Poland, in eastern Poland, later coming under Russian tutelage. And in that town of Kamenets, the Jacob Frank succeeded in persuading the bishop to hold a disputation between the rabbis and the Frankists, and this was to be accompanied by the burning of Talmuds, because Jacob Frank was furiously, vengefully hateful of the Talmud and the entire rabbinic oral Torah tradition. Well, now, these disputations took place in the years 1658 and 1659. And from the very fact that you see that Baal Shem Tov, founder of Hasidism, is fighting tooth and nail with other very distinguished rabbis of Poland against the Frankist movement, that is proof that Hasidism has nothing to do with Sabbateanism or its later incarnation as Frankism. And what we shall be seeing is that, in fact, Sabbatianism was able to penetrate Jewish communities to the extent that many, many disillusioned Jewish people who were falling away from Jewish tradition and practice were permeated by the Sabbatean philosophy, which is basically Epicureanism. It's all permitted. Enjoy yourself, eat what you like, think what you like, read what you like, sleep with whom you like. And indeed, there are many testimonies that the Sabbateans encouraged all kinds of illicit sexual relationships. Well, now, all of this was documented by a very remarkable American Jewish businessman and rabbi, now passed from the world, by the name Rabbi Moshe Antelman, Rabbi Marvin Antelman. And his first book on this subject was the book To Eliminate the Opiate. To Eliminate the Opiate was a historical research of the connection between the Sabbateans of the time of Jacob Frank, the Neo-Sabbateans, with the Jewish assimilated or increasingly assimilated leadership, including no less than Moses Mendelssohn and the founder of the House of Rothschild, who both happened to be in Frankfurt at the same time that Jacob Frank was in Frankfurt. And this book, To Eliminate the Opiate, basically documents the joining between the Sabbateans and what was to become Freemasonry and banking and finance. Now, obviously, the name of Rothschild is very much associated with all kinds of contemporary conspiracy theories. And since the Rothschild banking family is so very extensive and very powerful, and people say, look, they're Jewish, they are used to tar the entire Jewish people with these terrible slurs. And we should be aware that in the Rothschild family today across the world, I dare say that there's hardly a single one that is truly Jewish according to halakha. This certainly applies to, for example, Lord Jacob Rothschild of Britain, who is one of the leaders of the whole thing and is certainly not Jewish by any halachic definition. He may have Jewish blood in his veins from Jewish men that slept with non-Jewish women, but never has there been in recent generations any formal Jewish marriage and certification with a ketuvah in the Rothschild family that would be valid halachically. So these people cannot be called true B'nai Israel, true Yehudim. They are, in fact, together with many other associates, they are the people that are referred to by the Holy Zohar and by many Jewish thinkers today as the Eruv Rav, the mixed multitude, who use their Judaism when their Jewish so-called roots, when it suits them, but actually are following an agenda that has nothing to do with the true agenda of Torah and mitzvot, which is simply to serve God with prayer, mitzvot, Shabbat, festivals, charity, kindness, etc., until God will have mercy on us and send his Mashiach. But the Frankists and their followers, the disillusioned Jews across many parts of the Jewish world, East and West, increasingly in the 18th century, they had their thoughts elsewhere. And they wanted to attain this new life of freedom, and in many cases they decided their hope, their dream was to move westwards across Europe, at the very least to the more enlightened countries of France and of Britain, etc., and hopefully to the New World. Well, now, Baal Shem Tov, after winning a remarkable victory against the Frankists at the disputation in the year 1758 and 59, with the death of the bishop who had wanted to burn the Talmuds, the untimely death just before he succeeded, it was just a year afterwards, in 1760, that Baal Shem Tov himself left the world. And Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, in his Sefer Likutei Moharan, Part 1, teaching 207, addresses the Sabbatian movement and the death of Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Nachman explains that the Sabbatian movement were launching a frontal attack on the Torah Shebe'al Peh, and this had to be sweetened, and if the tzaddik of the generation was unable to sweeten it with his life, through his life's activities, he would have to do so through his histalkut, through his death. And Rabbi Nachman writes explicitly what is known by the Hasidim, by tradition, that Baal Shem Tov gave his life and was willing to be taken and ascend to heaven in order to sweeten and mitigate the terrible judgments against the people of Israel coming from this Eruv Rav of the unholy alliance between Sabbateans, the growing Freemasonry movement, the Rothschild family and their banking connections, all tapping into elements in Jewish communities that wanted to become emancipated, wanted to become secularized, wanted to become cultured, modern Europeans. Well, now let's fast forward to the life of Rabbi Nachman himself, who was born 12 years after the passing of Baal Shem Tov. And when Rabbi Nachman began to attract his greatest followers, Rabbi Nachman was then aged 30, and he had just moved into the town of Breslov, where he would spend most of the last 8 years of his life. This was back in 1802, when Rabbi Nachman first met his closest disciple, the 22-year-old Rabbi Nosson. Rabbi Nachman said to him, "My goal is to restore Hasidus to its original mission, with dancing, with hand clapping, with singing, with fervent devotion, and with the two foundations of prayer and Torah." So Rabbi Nachman clearly saw his mission as being the continuation of the mission of Baal Shem Tov. And we can see the consequences of this growing assimilation of Jewish communities, their growing involvement in materialism, reflected in Rabbi Nachman's writings, his teachings, and particularly graphically in his very lengthy Sipurei Masiot, the stories of Rabbi Nachman, where in particular the stories of the prayer leader, the 12th of the 13 Sipurei Masiot, as well as some other stories, particularly do seem to relate to the growing movement that was developing out of these initial contacts there in Frankfurt between the founder of modern Freemasonry and the Rothschild family and Jacob Frank. Well, now recently, a very heroic individual by the name of Edward Snowden, in an interview he gave from Russia, said that it's not just that there's a conspiracy, he said there are many, many conspiracies. And while we may like to completely compartmentalize and categorize things, and to say that, well, surely we can trace it all to Sabbateanism. It's not so simple. Here we see the alignment in Frankfurt, beginning to spread against the Jewish world, the alignment of Moses Mendelssohn, the founder of the Haskalah movement, the so-called Enlightenment, Jewish Enlightenment, which led to a departure from much earlier tradition, with Rothschild, with the founder of modern Freemasonry, with Jacob Frank. But there are all kinds of different people had different interests in this. The man in the Jewish village somewhere in the middle of rural Poland, with his peasants refusing to pay their bills for vodka, etc., he probably basically wanted to find a better life somewhere else, without the persecution, without all the troubles. Well, now, when Rabbi Nachman traveled to the town of Breslov in the year 1802, on his journey to the town from his previous place of residence, he passed through a town now well known to us by the name of Uman. That was his first visit to this town, which was the site of the then notorious massacre of, at the very least, 20,000 Jewish people in the space of 3 days by the Haidamaks, the resuscitated Khmelnytsky barbarians. 20,000 people in the space of 3 days buried in the cemetery of Uman. And already 8 years before Rabbi Nachman's death, which took place in 1810, then in 1802, on his way to the town of Breslov, passing through Uman, already Rabbi Nachman, with his profoundly spiritual eyes, saw this burial place of the martyrs of Uman, and was already willing that he would be buried there. And during the Shabbat that he spent in the town of Uman, on his way before leaving for Breslov, on the Shabbat he was sitting at his Shabbat table, and in came a person who was a member of what Rabbi Nachman later was to call the brain of the serpent. A young man who was associated with a group of people who were absolute Jewish heretics, people who had taken an oath never to mention the name of God, people who were sworn to depart from the Torah. These were examples of the new maskilim, the new people that consider themselves to be enlightened, and they wanted the life of Europe. They wanted to shave off their beards, cut off their side curls, abandon their traditional dark, long Jewish costumes in favor of colorful European costumes and all the graces and airs of European cultured society. Now, one of these had actually written a book of which only one copy survives in the world, in the British Museum, and the book is a translation into Yiddish of a work written in German in the previous few years by the name of Die Entdeckung von Amerika, the Discovery of America. And this book was a description of this vast continent with its untold natural wealth, with gold in them there hills, which at that time, of course, by and large, although there were already Jewish communities forming in America, the bulk of the population movement that was to take place in the 19th century had not yet even begun. Now, one of those three of the brain of the serpent in Uman was the author of a Yiddish translation of this German work about America. And this translation at the time was the #1 hit among Jewish women and girls across Eastern Europe who did not by and large know Hebrew but did know Yiddish. And this was their hit. You can imagine how dreams of the new life and the new world were being inspired by this book. Well, now, on that Shabbat, Rabbi Nachman, when one of those three came to his Shabbos table at lunchtime, he sent him away. He said, "You want somebody important? There's a Russian general in the hotel across the road." And the young man was rather upset about this. He brought his two fellows back in the afternoon, and at the table, Rabbi Nachman began discussing the question about the relationship between the radius of a circle and its circumference, which is discussed in the Talmud in various places, in Tractate Sukkah, Tractate Eruvin. And this was quite out of character with the great mass of Hasidic leaders who were only interested in very, very profound devotion, but did not seem to have the Torah brain that these people would respect. And here was this young man of 30 years old who was discoursing on these mathematical issues, and they saw that he was not one of the usual Hasidim. You have to understand, these three people who wielded great influence in the Jewish community of Uman had succeeded in preventing Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev entering the town and coming to settle there. So great was their hatred of Hasidism. And Rabbi Nachman enchanted them, and they made a deal with him that when they will send him the book of their mentor, Rabbi Naftali Wiesel, one of the earlier Haskalah rabbis who had written a whole new interpretation of books of the Tanakh, that would be the sign that Rabbi Nachman himself should come to live in Uman, which he did after receiving a copy of that book in the year 1810, early summer, and moved to Uman. Now, Rabbi Nachman's teachings in this period, particularly, as I said, in the story of the prayer leader, reflect a profound understanding of the aspirations of these new assimilated Jewish maskilim who were drawing influence from the Sabbateans, from the disappointment, from the Haskalah, from Moses Mendelssohn, from the surrounding secular enlightenment that was going on, interested in science and philosophy, etc., etc. Rabbi Nachman, for those familiar with his writings, was the bulwark of emunah against all this, and indeed did succeed with those three heretics in Uman. Eventually, each one of them repented at the end of their lives. But in the story of the prayer leader, Rabbi Nachman depicts this king that had a group of 10 ministers, 10 including his warrior, his orator, his dear friend, his treasurer, and other officials, and how they all got scattered in this enormous storm, which is like the Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels, and in their place developed these fake leaders. And among the fake cults which developed from the king's wealth, there develops a whole people who are interested only in the pursuit of wealth, the country of wealth. And the king's prayer leader has the mission of bringing the country of wealth to repent and come back to true faith in God Almighty. Well, in the story of the prayer leader, of which you can read extracts in my work, The Essential Rabbi Nachman, available online on our Zamra website, there is a detailed caricature in the style of the great 18th century secular writers and masters of satire and caricature. There's a caricature of this kingdom of wealth with their badges for the different statuses, from the top guys, the stars, and the planets, to lower grades until you got down to people that are barely human or less than human, animals, birds, dogs. Everybody in the kingdom had a grade according to his wealth. And now the people were worried about the threat from the king's mighty warrior, and they wanted to move to a secure place where they would have greater wealth and greater security. Well, it seems to me that with all the profound Kabbalistic secrets in this story, there's also the element of the ultimate falling of the people into the sin of the golden calf, into the sin of materialism, and now only the prayer leader, who is Moshe Rabbeinu, is able to redeem the people from this. But all of this sinful life of the pursuit of wealth is depicted exactly as you might depict the orders of Freemasonry, with the various grades of Freemasonry, which, as I've mentioned, does have connections with the Sabbatean influence. Well, now, Rabbi Nachman was presenting to us a picture of what is ongoing and developing in the Jewish people, and what Rabbi Antelman's books, including Volume 2, To Illuminate the Open, updates the story from the 18th and 19th centuries up into the 20th century to actually show the connection between the secularized, assimilated Jews having sprung forth from the Sabbateans, their connections with the great Jewish banking figures, not only of Rothschild but also of Schiff and various other major banking figures, Sachs, etc., their connections with leaders of so-called modern Jewish culture and so on. And what Rabbi Antelman demonstrates in these works bring it right up to the capitulation of left-leaning liberal Jewish communities, for example, in Massachusetts, under threats from surrounding black communities back in the 60s and 70s, and from then on until today, where we see this absolute major capitulation of the assimilated Jewish left to the most anti-Jewish and anti-Torah and anti-faith stances. Rabbi Antelman traces all this. So I was turned on to Rabbi Antelman's books by a very remarkable journalist living in Israel, passed away some years ago, who was the first to break open the secrets of the so-called assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in the year 1995. And this individual, by origin a Jew from Canada, who'd come to live in Israel, served in the army, and was a economics journalist, found too many inconsistencies in the official stories and inquiries, and went into a full-blown investigation into the Rabin assassination. His name is Barry Hamish, of blessed memory, who, as a reward for his assiduous work, was hounded out of Israel. His car brakes were cut and other acts of sabotage. He was persecuted mercilessly until he ended up on a caravan site in America, I believe in Florida, where he passed away some years ago, but Baruch Hashem was brought to burial in Israel. And Barry Hamish was a student of Rabbi Marvin Antelman and considered Rabbi Marvin Antelman his intellectual Rebbe, and the one that opened up to him the meaning of Jewish history. Well, now, Barry Hamish wrote this book, whose title I think speaks for itself. And if you want to see examples of the influence of the tradition of Shabtai Tzvi on Israeli society in the last century, the place to look is not Hasidism. The place to look is the Israeli left, which was represented by the original party of power in Israel, the Israeli Labour Party, which in some shape or form survives today with contemporary reincarnations. And in order to grasp these connections visually, let's just take a look at the Israeli Supreme Court, which, as anybody who's aware of how things run in Israel today knows, that the Israeli Supreme Court is the single most influential body in the land of Israel, unelected, consisting of a panel of Supreme Court judges who basically choose each other And the building in which they reside is very conspicuous in western Jerusalem, not far from the Jerusalem bus station. And anybody who knows anything about Freemasonry can see very conspicuously on the roof of the Supreme Court the same image that we see on the dollar bill of United States of America, with the pyramid with its unfinished head. Well, here in the Supreme Court it's actually a pyramid, but everybody knows that this is a Freemasonry symbol. And if you want to know more about this particular building, then do a search, internet search on sinister sites. There's a whole website devoted to sinister sites across the world, including the European Union headquarters in Brussels, and including, for example, the Denver International Airport, and among them is the Israeli Supreme Court, with numerous illustrations of what's inside, and it's absolutely full of Freemasonry symbols. Well, if you want to see a religious service taking place, here it is prior to the building of what was to be the home of the Israeli Supreme Court. You can even see a pyramid in the picture here. This is a picture of the Rothschild family, who actually donated the entire sum of the building of the Supreme Court to the State of Israel, just as the Rothschild family built the Israeli Knesset. And here they are with the leaders of the Israeli Labour Party. You can see at the front of the picture, second from the sitting in the forefront to the left of the picture, you can see the late Shimon Peres, and you can see others there, the head of the Supreme Court of the time, and Yitzhak Rabin, and others, all looking with spiritual awe at this temple of, what shall we call it, the perversion and the corruption of Torah law, where the self-elected, self-chosen judges of the Supreme Court basically come up with anything they want to and find some spurious justification legally for it that will impress their legal colleagues in Brussels and elsewhere across the Hague and elsewhere across the world. Well, now, it's much more than just the Supreme Court of Israel. This goes right through the so-called, what we might call the deep state of Israel. And there's much evidence of actual Sabbatean and occult influence on these people. There have been discoveries of mysterious apartments in Tel Aviv that were filled with occult equipment and paraphernalia, and much more evidence. Well, we've only touched the surface. Edward Snowden has said it's not one conspiracy, there are many, many conspiracies. It was the CIA that is credited with the idea that anybody who tells a story about trying to reconstruct and interpret events that may have happened is a conspiracy theorist. This came into vogue after the assassination of J.F. Kennedy, which is widely thought to have been some kind of deliberate plot. And anybody who comes up with such ideas is discredited as a conspiracy theorist. Anything the person might write on Facebook is said to be have failed the fact checkers or fact shredders investigations, and the person is smeared with being a faker. Well, as Edward Snowden has expressed, you see, there are all kinds of different networks of people with different interest groups, and they may work together and they may work independently, sometimes pulling in different directions and even in conflict with each other. But to say there are no conspiracies, we have to understand that events do not unfold by themselves. It is people who cause events to unfold, and it is God who puts thoughts into people to cause events to unfold. And God has created the wicked as he has created the righteous. And God puts the most evil thoughts into the wicked because he wants to destroy them and show that he will destroy them in the end. But it's a very, very, very long process. So we cannot just say that there is one Sabbatean conspiracy that is behind the state of Israel, the government of Israel, the secularization of Jewish representative organizations in North America, in other countries across the world. We cannot say it's all one source. What I can say is that there is no connection whatever between Sabbatianism and Hasidism. The Hasidim have no time for the occult, have no interest in dominating the world financially or in any other way except by spreading the truth of the Torah to fellow members of the people of Israel and to all of the nations of the world. No connection between Hasidism and the occult. I have never found a single Orthodox rabbi that was actually a Freemason, for example, and I've known Freemasons and spoken to Freemasons and discussed Freemasonry with Freemasons, and I've never found an Orthodox rabbi that had the least interest in it. That cannot be said for example, the late Shimon Peres and the late Yitzhak Rabin, both of whom were Freemasons, both of whom had intimate connections with David Rockefeller, and they were all part of the same thing. This is such an enormous subject, but I do want to emphasize that far from being connected with anything to do with the occult, Hasidism is the very opposite of this heresy, the very opposite of this attempt to destroy the people of Israel, destroy the world with immorality and with crime. Hasidism is about restoring the faith in the 7 commandments of the children of Bnei Noah to all the world, and Hasidism is about bringing Melech Moshiach to reveal himself to all the world. And with that, may we all have a true Kabbalat HaTorah on the coming festival of Shavuot this year, this coming festival, as we now enter the month of Sivan and the time of receiving of our Torah.